Dear ladies and gentlemen, my name is Lauri Nummenmaa. I'm a professor of medical imaging at Turku Pet Center, and I'm talking to you about one of our main research topics, which is the neurobiology of emotions, and especially this time I'm going to highlight the neurobiology of emotions in the context of horror movies. Fear is probably the most powerful emotion that humans have. It has to be because it guarantees our survival. It protects us from predators, aggressive people, heights, and in general from getting ourselves hurt. The fear is also clinically the most important emotion because pathologies of the fear system such as anxiety and phobias constitute a main look of numerous psychiatric disorders. So to that end, it's critical that we understand how the fear systems and the anxiety systems work out in the typically performing brain in the normal conditions and healthy individuals. And horror movies are actually an excellent way of understanding the brain basis of fears because they provide us a convenient means for evoking rather natural and extremely strong emotions in our participants in the laboratory setting. So this is why we have set up a research program for investigating what happens in the brain when we are afraid of the thrills that we see in horror movies. The horror movies are also a powerful means for us researchers because they accurately mimic the kind of fears that we have in the mind, like the ancestral fears that have been embedded in the human mind during the thousands and hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. First of all, if we look at the proportion of clinically significant phobias in adult population, we see a clear pattern. So most of the phobias, that are clinically significant phobias that people have, are geared towards something that could actually happen in the natural environment. So the most common phobias are those that are related to heights or snakes or closed spaces or spiders. And in general, it's rare to see a phobia that's associated with something that would not actually be capable of causing you harm in the real life, in the real wild world. And these kind of pathologies of the fear system also closely mirror to the prevalence of common everyday fears that people have. We have done large-scale studies where we have simply asked people, what are you afraid of? And how strongly are you afraid of different things? And this kind of everyday fear, non-pathological fears, mirror closely the pathological end of the fears that people do have. So the strongest fears that people actually have, they are usually social fears. So we are most strongly afraid of close one of ours becoming ill or close one of us being dead, and also that of course something bad happening to us, getting seriously ill or getting cheated on in social relationships and so forth and so forth. But all of this suggests that the fear system is geared towards the kind of threats that we might encounter in the wild, in the environment, rather than something that we would have learned during the exposure to the natural environment. And curiously, or not curiously, but naturally, this pattern of fear is also well known by the horror movie directors. So if we look at large-scale studies on what people perceive as scary in the horror movies, we can also see that the horrors that people find most scary or most potent are also those that could be sort of encounterable in the real life. The teen horror and gothic horror movies or skiffy horror movies or monster horror movies are not actually rated as that scary because these are goofy, spoofy, and the threats that we encounter in these movies are something that we are unlikely to stumble upon in our real lives. Whereas the scariest horror movie types, the psychological horror or the stories based on real events or human criminals or tortures, again, play around with the threats that we actually might stumble upon if we are unlucky in the real life. So this kind of a preparedness to be afraid of a specific events that are really dangerous to us, but not just everything, is a potent mechanism that is used for generating these thrills in the movies that the Hollywood and the other filmmaking industries are pouring to us eyes in the movie theaters. And this all shows that even though the horror movies, they are just made by the industry and they are not depictions of actual real life, they are pretty good simulations of the type of things that people are afraid of in their real life. So we can use them for at least approximating the brain system function or the brain fear system function during everyday environment. And we have looked at the brain bases or sort of like psychological response to horror across multiple levels. So first of all, we have studied the central nervous system, the brain. What happens in the brain when people become afraid, when they are watching thrills of a horror films? But because the fear, it's not just something that happens in the brain, it's also a strongly corporal phenomenon. We have also looked into the bodily responses to threat. Because the threat not just engages your protective systems in the brain, it also prepares our bodies to run and fight and flight. So it's important to understand what kind of a consequences do these kind of a threat signals have on our bodily functions, and this is what we are also looking to. And then, because the horror is not just a neural and not just bodily, but also strongly psychological a concept, we are also looking into what happens into the minds, the psychological systems in the individuals when they become afraid while they are watching horror. And we're most interested in the attention. How does the viewing of different threatening versus non-threatening signals in the movies change the way that we look at things, and whether we pay more attention to the scary events, and is our eye movement gaze guidance system somehow influenced by the threats that we observe in these kind of films. And in this series of studies we have used common and popular movies from the Hollywood. We began this investigation by simply looking at what people rate as the scariest horror movie that they have ever seen. We conducted a large-scale internet questionnaire and simply asked people to rate or at least the scariest horror movies that they had seen. And this is what we found. The scariest movie in this study was by a large margin The Devil's Backbone, espinazo, diablo. And this was followed by The Wailing, The Conjuring, and various other well-known horror movies. We however had some other criteria for our study rather than a pure scariness for choosing the movies that we investigate, and because we were particularly interested in what happens during the jump scares, the sudden threats, sudden scares that directors sprinkle around the movie. We also computed how many of these kind of a jump scare events each of these movies had, and chose some of the top movies that had the largest number of these jump scares. The original questionnaire had over 100 movies to choose from, so this is just the top 10. And then the movies that had the largest number of jump scares and were rated consistently as the scariest were these two, which we then ultimately chose for the basis of the investigation. So recap, the top one was Diablo, followed by The Wailing, The Conjuring, and the ones that we actually chose for the investigation were The Insidious and Conjuring, which were both rated as a scary and having a high content of jump scares. We then conducted these investigations at multiple different systems and levels. First of all, we recorded brain activity of our participants using a technique that is called the functional magnetic resonance imaging. These kind of scanners are omnipresent in hospitals and research units because they can be used for diagnosing various diseases and conditions, but they can also be used for quantifying brain activity. So in our studies, we simply put the participants inside the scanner. They are lying in the comfort of the hospital bed. We put on the recording equipment and headphones that the participants can hear the movie sounds during the recording, and then we also set up a screen in front of her, actually in this case behind their eyes, that they can see through a mirror, so that we can then deliver the whole horror movie to their eyes and their ears during the recording. So it's not quite a movie theater, but it is close as we can get in this context. And then we record the brain activity while they are watching the movie. That's about like 1.5 hours. And we also ask the participants to rate how scared they were during different parts of the movie. So we get a time series of the fear that they feel during the movie, and then we also know when the jump scares kick in during the movie, so we can model what happens in the brain, especially during these scariest jump scare events. And this is what we found. If we look into what kind of a brain systems kick in when the people are watching the movie and these jump scares or boos come on the screen, we see a couple of pretty important brain systems implicated in fear are becoming increasingly activated. First of all, in the so-called sagittal section, which is dividing the brain in this direction, we see first of all the brainstem circuits that manage autonomic responses and this kind of a fight and flight responses in the brain. Then we see a brain region that is called the cingulate cortex that is particularly involved in emotion regulation, when you have to tone down or turn off your own affective responses. Then we see the striatum, which is involved both in emotional processing and also motor control. So when we need to withdraw, run away from the scary event, the striatal system kicks in. And then we also see increasing activity in the sensory cortices, in the auditory cortices in here, and in the visual cortex, which is in the back of your head. So the sensory processing of the horror movie becomes increasingly stronger when we see something bad happening in the front of our eyes. So you can see this pretty comprehensive activation in the brain that kicks in when we become afraid, when we are startled, and this system ensures that we change our locus of attention to what's important, like the scary event in here. It prepares us to run away from the target that we are now afraid of, and it also controls our regulatory responses that we can try to dampen the emotion if needed, and also then fight against the threat if we encounter that. Then of course we have been looking into like the bodily responses, what happens in the body when people are afraid. This is done on like in a separate studies using like a online reporting tool where people can report their subjective sensations in the body during different affective states. We have done this in hundreds of thousands of individuals currently using different emotional experiments. But when we look at the scary events in movies and scary emotions, we can consistently see that the different emotions such as despair and fear and panic and anxiety, they all share a similar kind of bodily signature. So when people feel these fear-related and negative emotions, we can see that there's strong experience of activation in the chest area, probably relating to the heart starting to pump harder and breathing increasing, and also in the feet, especially legs, in the case of panic. So people start to sort of like prepare to run away from the threat that they've observed, and also in the chest area, stomach area. We also know how the fears can make our stomach churn and twist, and it can almost feel sometimes like somebody stabbed a knife into our belly when we are really afraid. So this again demonstrates how powerful emotion the fear is, that it can also capture not just the brain but also the body and change literally the state of our body to better match the survival needs that we are encountering when we're seeing something nasty, something worth being scared of. And this is also highlighted when we look at the more cognitive processes such as attention, what people look into in their environment. And we have done this by recording eye movements of the participants while they are viewing this kind of horror movies. And this is just like two illustrative screens from an eye movement recording where people were watching this kind of a horror movie. So if you look at first this frame, we can see that when there is no apparent threat in the scene, so it's kind of a safe scene, the attention of the participants is distributed all over the place. Each participant's gaze position is indicated by one red dot, and you can see that the attention is all over the place. People are just individually looking for cues of what might be important, what might be interesting in this scene. But then when the threat kicks in, when there is something really worth attending to, something scary, such as the nun in this scene, you see that the attention automatically drifts towards the scary event in the frame. So it's almost really highly automatic that the attention is captured by the threats and the dangers in the environment, because our brain instinctively knows that we need to be afraid of these things, like somebody jumping on our head in the darkness, and we definitely need to work out what that is to be able to survive. So that's why the attention system prioritizes searching and processing of this kind of a highly emotional information in the environment to make sure that we pay attention to what might kill us or at least injure us or hurt us. And we can also measure other things from the eye tracking data. We can also measure the size of the pupil of the individual. And we know from a large number of studies that the pupil responds not just to the light that is landing on the retina, but also to the affective content of the environment. And what we have done in this study is that we have continuously recorded the size of the pupil of the participants, and then we can look what happens to the pupil size around the jump scare events. So on the left side of this graph, you can see the time preceding the actual jump scare, which is denoted by the vertical bar. And on the right side, you can see what happens to the pupil size when the jump scare comes on to the screen. And each of these lines that I will now show you in real time show the pupil size for one individual. And you can see it's pretty down and low before the jump scare, but then when the threat comes on the screen, when the fear comes as powerful as it can get, there's a huge surge in the increase of the pupil size, and you can see that it occurs constantly across every single individual that we have tested. So again, suggesting that there's a strong biological response towards the fear, the jump that happens in the movie, that is then taking place at the same time course and same temporal cascade in all of the individuals. So we can also see that we can just use the eye movements for measuring the degree of fear in the movies. So it's a really comprehensive array of responses that the fear triggers in ourselves. It triggers the cerebral response, it triggers the bodily responses, it changes our attention, and it also changes our arousal as indicated by the changes in the pupil size. And I hopefully have convinced you that this is like a very powerful means for studying relatively lifelike fears. Of course, we know that the fears in the movies, they are not real. But still, they pass the reality filter of the brain most of the time. Of course, we can always start to think that this is not scary, this is not real, and that's why we shouldn't be afraid of this. But as soon as we give away with this kind of a cognitive emotion regulation control, we start to become genuinely fearful of the movie contents again. But the final thing I probably want to tell you is that the scares that we experience during the movies or horror movies, they are kind of a paradoxical, and everybody usually wonders that why is it so? That we go to the horror movies, we do the cinema to see something that we would never want to experience in real life. We never want to be chased by somebody with an axe, or we never would like to encounter some supernatural monsters, or we would never want to fight against our lives with some psychopath who's coming to us. But why do we want to do this in the cinema? Why do we go to cinema? We enjoy something that would be actually horrible in the real life if we come to think of that. I think there are at least like four answers to this question. One is what I call the mixed signals for arousal, because I just demonstrated you that the horror movies lead to strong affective arousal. And this is of course nasty thing in the context of fear, but we also do get similar kind of arousal response during various positive emotions. And it is possible that the arousal in the brain gets mixed in our mind. So we mix the negative arousal with the positive arousal and interpret in the cozy context of the movie theater the sort of threat-related arousal as a positive one, which makes us feel good. And of course it feels good when the threats go away in the movie every now and then, so that's another source of pleasure. Then the other thing is that the horror movies, they have what I call the optimized intensity for fear. There's a bulk of research literature suggesting that actually if you make the horrors too crazy, too powerful, too gory, then people no longer enjoy it. So you have to sort of make them scary enough, powerful enough, but not too scary so people can enjoy them. And this is clearly illustrated in children. We don't present children with the type of horror movies that we present adults with, but the kids can enjoy age-appropriate little scares, tiny scares that they actually find amusing in a similar way that adults might experience the horror movies. So it has to be appropriately titrated. Then the third thing is that humans are simply curious creatures. We want to find out how the world works, what's in there, and what could be possibly experienced. So the horror movies give us an opportunity to experience and explore something that we might not be able to explore in the real life, and we might actually find something that we wouldn't otherwise be able to find ever in our lives. And this is an important kind of a learning and preparation mechanism. I call the movies this kind of a mental gym. So we go to horror movies and we go to other types of movies to practice and rehearse experiencing into both nasty situations and in nice situations. So I mean that we never want to be chased by somebody with a axe. We don't want to be chased by a killer. But in the movies we can rehearse this kind of experiences and this kind of sensations in a safe environment. Which means that if, for some unfortunate reason, we would sometimes have to be running away from a murderer or killer or whatever, we are at least psychologically a bit prepared for these kind of situations, which should give us an upper hand, it should give us an advantage. And same goes for the other emotions. We can go to watch like sad movies and happy movies and disgusting movies to learn a bit about ourselves, how do we respond to different emotional scenarios, how we respond to different situations without actually having to put ourselves at a risk. So at their best, the movies and the horror movies, they can actually be a good emotional learning experiences as long as we titrate their strengths appropriate so that we don't go over what we experience as pleasurable. And this is everything I had you for today. Just a brief glimpse towards the neuroscience of horror movies, and greetings from Turku, University of Turku and Turku Pet Center. And I hope that this all gives you an opportunity to enjoy the next horror movie that you will see from a slightly different perspective, and you're armed with a little bit more knowledge about how the film directors make the horror movies so scary. So I thank you for listening to your talk and wish you all a great day.